I'm going to continue along with this theme, and I'm going to introduce a panel up here to join me now, because we all want to know how to live happy, but can giving help us reach that goal? So welcome to the panel session, and you can submit questions to this via the app. If you've got it in front of you, just click on the session in your program. This session is called Why Volunteers Volunteer, Give Happy, Live Happy. I might just remain up here where I am because I don't think I can fit on that desk there. I just want to kick this off by asking each of our panel a question just to get the ball rolling. As I'd say, really this is your chance to ask the experts what you're feeling and thinking and wanting to know about in this space. Why volunteers volunteer, perhaps how your organisation can be doing things a little bit better, tightening things up, so to speak. Joe, first of all, what is research saying about this topic, why volunteers are volunteering? I think if you just speak into that should...
Can you hear me?
Harry? Yes. Yep.
Well, hopefully good research is valid when it's giving expression to the knowledge of people like you. So I'm hoping that the research doesn't tell you anything that you don't intuitively know. And rather than repeat what our colleagues at PwC have just presented, I thought I'd pick out a couple of things that may not be top of mind in terms of what people get out of volunteering in your day-to-day work. And one of those is time structure. One of the projects that we're working on right now, and I acknowledge my colleague, Associate Professor Wendy Scaife from Queensland University of Technology, who's in the audience somewhere, is the project lead for Giving Australia project, which is the largest study of giving and volunteering in Australia, commissioned by the Prime Minister's Community Business Partnership. One of the things that's coming out of the very large number of focus groups we've done for this project is that issue of time structure, whether that's for someone who's involuntarily in a state of unemployment, whether it's someone who's experiencing what it's like to be living after retirement, whether it's someone who's had someone they care for die recently. Having time structure, being involved with other people, having something to do is a very important aspect of what people get out of volunteering. And the second one, because I'm conscious we're just keeping this brief now, that I wanted to pick up on that's under-discussed both in popular conversation and in research is volunteering as therapy. I did a project with some colleagues and in partnership with Volunteering Queensland a few years ago on the enormous voluntary response to the Queensland 2009-10 floods. And one of the things that really came out of that was that an offer to help was a cry for help. And many people were looking for some outlet through which to process their trauma in relation to the floods. And similarly in Giving Australia, we're seeing people telling us stories about their experience of when a loved one dies, for example, and turning to volunteering as a process through which they rehabilitate, if you like. So they're two slightly outlying reasons for what people get out of volunteering.
Thanks, Joe. Is everyone able to hear that okay? Up the back? That's all right? So we do have a couple of handheld mics here. Brian, hey, congratulations on the ACT Volunteer Team of the Year 2014.
Thank you. As you can see, I'm not the whole team, just one very small part of it, obviously.
But you're the leader of the team from what I understand. You are a volunteer leader of volunteers. So I was just wondering that as part of this conversation, if you are able to, what have you witnessed, I suppose, over the time of looking after your volunteers, how they've changed, what have you seen in those people as a result of their volunteering?
So I predominantly work in the youth sector, so the participants that we work with are aged between 6 and 18 years. And the volunteers that we get for the program start about 16, 17, all the way up through to sort of late 20s, early 30s. So I feel our volunteers are all in a period of transition in their life, or they can see a transition happening. So it might be finishing school, finishing university, moving out of home, starting full-time work. So these people are really trying to engage with their community and trying to build on their skills for what they're going to need for that next step in their life. because they've got this transition period, I think people throw around the term social justice. They think that volunteering is a good thing. People that they know volunteer, so they initially get involved for those fairly superficial reasons, and that's how I got involved. I just had some friends who were volunteering. I thought, hey, they sound like they're having some fun, so let's start with that. But it's not until they volunteer for a reasonable length of time, and it might only be a few months, some get back quite quickly, they actually start to see, well, wait a minute, I'm getting as much from this volunteering as I'm providing as well, the services that I provide. Things like resilience, the leadership skills, being able to strategise and be visionary depending on their level of commitment and what their role is as they volunteer. They're really building those skills, and they're skills that you see in everyday use in your home life and work life, school and uni. So I was able to see that quite early on and see the value that I was getting from my volunteering. I realised working with children that the skills that I've been able to get working with kids are basically the same skills for working with executives on the boards. They're pretty much the same.
Now what does that say?
So they've helped me in my career for sure. I've seen some of the most quietest volunteers gain so much confidence from the supportive environment that we have. And we like to think that the supportive environment that we provide for our participants is the exact same environment that we want to provide for our volunteers. I think that's a really important message there. So without that support, that strength, you don't see that growth and those benefits. I guess my pledge to you guys is to make sure that as much as you keep the clients as the heart of the program, you need to keep the volunteers as the heart of that program as well. And that will ensure that the volunteers that do come will stay because they see the fantastic benefits that they can get as much as the participants.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you to those who have submitted questions already. Please excuse my back. Over to this side, so I've just realised I've got my back to you. So keep the questions coming through via the app, and we'll get to those shortly. Toby, we've got a room here full of volunteer organisations that who work with volunteers, but we heard from Jeremy that 86-87% of us feel that we need more volunteers in our lives. So how do we get more people in? How do we coax them in?
In 3 minutes?
Good luck.
Well, I'll echo what Ryan said about really paying attention to the experience and becoming, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow in plenary a little bit, excuse me, about becoming an architect of experience. And I was on a pro bono Australia webinar a couple weeks ago with Dr. Peter Devereaux, and he was talking about serious leisure. People take their volunteering very seriously. And so creating an experience that is fantastic really drives word-of-mouth marketing. And nowadays, when you're looking at attracting volunteers, the way you're looking at marketing is a lot different than it used to be. You know, it used to be marketing was taking a megaphone and shouting at the top of your lungs about your call to action. And nowadays, marketing, we're finding the public relations firm Edelman does a trust barometer report every year. If you're a PR buff, you probably know that one. And every year, this has been happening now for several years now, the trend has been moving up that people like me are now the most trusted, one of the most trusted messengers of information in marketing. So there's what they call the inversion of influence. So back in the day, it was the CEO, the government exec, government official, the NGO staffer who was the most trusted. And right now, it still tops off at professors and specific highly technical folks. So people in your white lab coats are still the most trusted. But the third in line now is people like me. And so when you think about looking for volunteers, who should be your spokespeople? Your volunteers themselves. And so what does that mean for us? It means for us as marketers, because we are marketers, really understanding very well how to prepare and gather testimonials that make sense from volunteers. And so it means learning how to ask the right questions, because if you ask a volunteer to provide a testimonial, first of all, they'll probably say, oh, no, I'm not the person to give you a testimonial. I'm not a marketer. I'm not a writer. I don't do anything out of the normal. I'm just here to help. And so you have to start asking good questions like, when you started volunteering, what surprised you? If you were able to tell someone who was considering volunteering with us, give them one piece of advice, what would that be? And if you were able to prompt a little bit, you could start to get some testimonials going, and that volunteers are really recruiting other volunteers. We also know there was a study done in 2004, Jeff Bredney and Mark Hager with the Urban Institute in the US, and they found that in terms of volunteer retention, you have much higher retention rates when volunteers are recruiting other volunteers. So this is actually good news all around.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks, Toby. Sue, great earrings.
Thank you.
Apropos of nothing, of course. What are the 3 things that organisations can do to reduce that horrible red tape and all the admin problems that we heard Jeremy speak a little bit about before?
Well, before I address that point, I just wanted to pick up on something that Toby said, because I'm a marketer. I'm a marketer, and I know in services marketing, the greatest success you can have is when your clients or your volunteers are actually become your advocates. You convert them into being your advocates. So I heartily endorse what you're saying. But to address the question that I was asked to address, I think the starting point, and it's something that we bang on about all the time at Volunteering Victoria, is great leadership. Great leadership, whether it be leadership within the organisation or at the volunteer management level. Because if you've got great leadership, it's the leaders in an organisation that are going to design a volunteering program, who are going to lead recruitment, who are going to do all the things that is required to run and deliver a great volunteering program in the best possible way. And one of the things that I see in the work that we do is that quite often there seems to be embedded red tape, and I don't think there's enough, we're not questioning often enough whether that red tape is actually necessary, and I suspect a lot of it isn't. And I would ask people to start thinking about, would you ask paid staff to jump through some of those hoops that volunteers are being asked to jump through? Is it always necessary to get a police check for every volunteer that walks through the door? Because I bet you a lot of organisations might ask their volunteers to do that, but don't actually ask their staff to do that. And I think one of the things that I really struggle with in this role is to see the discrimination that is perpetuated against volunteers. I think volunteers are part of the workforce for most organisations, and yet they're discriminated against. And they're the people that are giving freely of their time without expectation of reward, yet we're often making it harder for them to engage because we're discriminating against them because somebody has told us many decades ago that they are different, they're perhaps less trustworthy. And I think we need to change our attitude. And that's not quite answering the question specifically, but I think it's down to us as leaders to actually think about how we're working with our volunteers, and are what we're asking them to do, is what we're asking them to do fair and reasonable? Is it balanced? Is it just excessive for the risk? I mean, is the risk minimal? At what point are what we are asking them to do adding value, or is it actually detracting from the experience?
Thanks, Sue. Now, Peter, you're with Beyond Bank. What's the most successful employee volunteering experience that your organisation has engaged in, and why is that so?
Yeah, I guess I should firstly say that Beyond Bank operate across the country, so we've got many different examples. We have community cinemas over in Western Australia, for those West Australians who will be aware of that. Boundless Canberra here in Canberra, for the All Abilities Playground that was built here. And we also have, actually we're launching today, a community partnership with the Fremantle Football Club over in WA. So we're actually working with lots of different variety of organisations, all about getting good stuff done in the community. Probably the best example I can give you about our staff volunteering is we've actually, for those who are aware of this, we run a Christmas pageant in Adelaide every year, and for the past 20 years, Beyond Bank have been a major supporter of the Christmas pageant. Around early November each year, around 300,000 people line the streets of Adelaide to watch the Christmas pageant. There's around 120 different floats that are involved, and more than 1,000 volunteers, and those volunteers are made up of primarily our staff and also the staff from other banks and credit unions that are actually involved in the sponsorship of that one. Just a terrific event, and from our point of view, not only do we get our staff involved, but we actually get our customers involved in that. A really special event to be involved in. In terms of why, I think, and CEO Robert sort of touched on some of this earlier today when he opened proceedings, this is about who Beyond Bank is, so it is who we are. It's actually, community for us is actually formally a part of the purpose of our business, the values of our business and the mission of our business. And so it's us doing what comes naturally, and I think from that point of view, we tend to actually get a lot of people who want to become staff members at Beyond Bank who are already sort of looking to be involved in those types of activity. The other one I would mention would be too that we're really careful about making sure what we're doing is meaningful. So there's a few examples of corporate volunteering, I think, and I spoke with I won't name the people, but a hospital in New South Wales who talked about a corporate volunteering program where he'd had one of the walls of the hospital painted something like 37 times since he'd been there, which was around about 5 years. So you just sort of say, well, really sort of might make people feel good for a little bit of time, but then they'll just get the next crew in and they're going to paint something different. We really concentrate on wanting to make an impact, and our staff are really enjoying that.
Thank you, Peter. You got a bit of a feel about the conversation today. I'm going to throw out a couple more questions and then go to our app questions. These are to any or all of you, whoever would like to respond. What is an organisation or volunteer manager's value proposition to sponsors or funding bodies or even their CEOs and board about why they should invest in any volunteering program?
Look, I'm happy to kick off. I think the main important part is that the proposition must be volunteer-led. How many times have we seen, you might have seen this in your own organisations, where you get a bunch of money to say, go meet a task. The staff organise that program and then go, right, now let's find the volunteers to work that program. How well do they go? When you get a volunteer-led proposition, you find a much greater success rate. So you need to sort of switch that around, make sure that the programs are volunteer-led and facilitated by the organisation.
Thanks, Ryan. Would anybody else like to contribute to that?
Can I take a contrary view? Because I don't think it's necessarily mutually exclusive, but I think, I mean, if you're talking to an organisation, the organisation is going to start thinking about what their strategic objectives and priorities are, and they may be looking for what is the best workforce required to deliver. What they should do is engage volunteers as part of the discussion about how the volunteers might contribute to delivering corporate objectives or priorities. And I think that's probably often what is missing. The volunteers don't have an opportunity, like other staff, to contribute to those discussions. So I guess I'm on that mantra again of not discriminating against volunteers. Let's recognise that volunteers are a valuable part of the workforce, and engage volunteers in the same way you might engage staff in supporting the delivery of the objectives of an organisation.
Thanks, Tobi.
Yeah, a few months ago I did a survey of volunteer managers, and one of the questions we asked was, what were their major challenges? And one of the challenges that emerged, and we had about 950, mostly from the US, but a few from Australia, a few from Canada, a few from the UK, about 80% from the US. And what we found, one of the big themes that came up was the struggle, which is why I'm doing a workshop on this tomorrow, or after this actually. One of the struggles is really getting the resources you need from within your organization, advocating for volunteers in the organization, getting budget, for example. 50% of the people who answered the survey did not know their own budget. Not only did they not know their organization's budget, they didn't know their own volunteer program budget, which I found crazy. How can you advocate if you don't know the money that you're given responsibility for? So when you're thinking value proposition, and I try to help people think, walking in your director's shoes, in your executive director's shoes, what's top of mind for them? Well, funding is top of mind for them. But when you think of volunteers, we know from research, volunteers are anywhere from 2 times, depending on what study you look at, to 10 times more often are donors than non-volunteers. And most volunteers, about 2/3 of volunteers, donated to organizations where they volunteer. And many organizations don't track donors and volunteers. They keep them separate. And I think it's really a really arbitrary division. Volunteers are donors, and donors are volunteers, and those groups of people are oftentimes the same people, but somehow they're arbitrarily thought of as separate. And so I think that's one barrier, this myth we need to break down. Not that you're going to have, volunteering isn't your fundraising strategy, but it certainly helps. And when those volunteers are generating funds for an organization and yet their program is under-resourced, that's a problem.
Thanks, Toby. We are also happy to take questions from the floor. If you're not using the app, you will see that there are microphones situated in the stairways. So more than happy to take questions from the floor. I might throw this one out to the panel as well. As volunteer leaders, this is a very popular question, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. As volunteer leaders, we complain about the lack of resources, low pay and disrespect. However, do you believe generally that volunteer leaders have the skills to advocate and make significant change at executive level?
I think it depends a little bit on your understanding of leadership. Leadership is a process, it's not a person. So anyone can be a leader in any structural position in any organisation. That's an important point to take up. And also to make a distinction between leadership and management. Management's about keeping things stable, leadership is about affecting change. So to the question, do leaders in your organisations have those capabilities? Well, I think you're a very large and diverse group. The answer would be yes and no, depending on which organisations, which people, etc. But perhaps what's important is that the organisational culture that supports the capacity for change, and whether you have that. So maybe that's an important question to ask. How can I lead effectively in an organisation if that culture for the kinds of future developments that Toby and Sue and others have been describing is not there? And how might what might I do in whatever role I'm in as a leader to contribute to creating that culture?
Thanks, Jo. Does anyone else want to contribute to that?
If you want to learn those skills, stick around. I'm going to teach them on this panel.
Okay, another very popular question here. What's the biggest risk the volunteering sector?
I'll have a shot at that, and I guess I always come from a corporate perspective here, but I've actually got a session at 4 o'clock talking about disruption and what does that mean for volunteering. And I just think that the biggest danger from my perspective right now is to keep the current system in place that's actually showing a decline in the level of people that are volunteering. So I'd say the biggest risk is to do nothing. The biggest risk is to think that everything's okay. I think there needs to be significant change.
I agree.
Just thinking about the focus groups that we run for Giving Australia across the country, of which we've done about 50 now, it's very clear that there's a major risk around the continuation of traditional forms of volunteering in communities where there's ageing populations, in communities where younger people are leaving to find work, and as younger people are looking for, what was described in the PwC report, more episodic forms of volunteering, we've got to really ask ourselves who's going to hold and manage the community infrastructure for the traditional kinds of volunteering in the future, particularly as we face contexts where governments are relying more and more on civil society organisations like yours to do that work.
I'm just going to pop back a question following on from what we had the question earlier about leadership that Joe answered. What sector does volunteer leadership best? What sector does volunteer leadership best? Ooh, you stumped him with that one.
Yeah, I suspect it's the sectors where in Victoria we work with a lot of different sectors, and one of the sectors that I think is taking a lead in Victoria is the health network. There's a really strong health network. I mean, it's easy to define the health network as well. It's a contained, and there are finite numbers, but we've got some amazing leaders in health leadership, health volunteering leadership. Some of them are in the room here, I know, and I think what is the sector that's probably doing it worse is the sector I'm very familiar with. I know you didn't ask the question, but I'm going to answer it. I think it's sport. I think sport does it badly.
Do we have any questions from the floor before I go back to the app again? Anyone who's not using the app that wants to ask a question from the floor? No? No? They're just riveted. All right. Where's the question over there? Oh, hello, sorry about that. Hello.
Without the microphone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just a comment about sport, comment there, or question, sorry. Sport, I agree, it's really badly run, but it is mostly filled by volunteers.
Yeah.
When you talk about grassroots. The biggest problem that I come across in my work is a lot of those structures are really bogged down with constitutions and general meetings, and nothing can happen until the next general meeting, which is a year away, and all that sort of thing. So are there any recommendations for the sports sector specifically? From the panel, anyone?
Well, I think not specifically for the sports sector, but you have to find the ways to engage with the volunteers, and obviously in the sports sector, as we know, that those volunteers are often the parents, and those parents are really time poor. So it's being able to fit around their schedules as well. It's well known that parents don't have a lot of time to give, but you've got to find what works for them. Many of them have office jobs, so they might have access to email, they might be on social media, so it's about broadening that communication channel to be able to make sure that you're not waiting those months in between to make decisions. You can still have that constant ongoing communication and that movement without being in a formalised structure, and I think that's something that a lot of organisations are struggling to deal with, breaking away from that traditional model of having to meet in a room of the organisation. It might be catching up for a coffee with a few of them, then sending the emails around later. Is everyone happy? Okay, let's move forward. It's about finding what works for that group.
I mean, I've got a couple of comments, I guess, having come from sport before my current role, is that I think one of the challenges for sport, they don't recognise their dependence on the volunteer workforce. And I know very, very few sporting organisations, particularly at club and association level, that actually will have somebody with a designated responsibility of supporting, managing, leading, whether formally or informally, volunteers in the sport. So they don't have the systems, they don't have the processes, they don't have the resources, they're not thinking about all the issues that you might normally expect an HR manager or a person responsible for a workforce to be thinking about. So you've got a lot of, you've got those general HR management issues around sport, and then also picking up on some of Ryan's points about the fact that a lot of the volunteers in sport are parents and have got limited time. It also goes back to the need to be adaptable and flexible and creative about the volunteering opportunities and the way the volunteer workforce in sport might be led or managed or supported. And I think often it's the model that might work in the health sector won't work in the sporting sector. We've just got to be much more creative about the way we manage, or the way sport might look at managing and leading their volunteer workforce.
Thank you, Sue. Popular question here. Do you see a continuing need for volunteer resource centres into the future?
Yes.
extrapolate?
Well, I think our sector needs all it can get, you know, in terms of resources. I just think, you know, there's certain things, there's some kind of on the edge, kind of burgeoning new things that are coming out, new trends per se. I don't even know how to put it. I'm just riffing on this. But when I think about volunteer resource centers, I think, what are the things that organizations are struggling with? Technology. Technology is one I hear all the time. What are the easiest tools to use? What are the low-cost tools to use? You know, I think volunteer resource centers could take a key role in vetting types of technology tools. So many are out there. There's apps galore, there's, you know, this and that. And, you know, once you get a group of volunteer managers together, everybody starts sharing. But if, you know, that's something that I think volunteer resource centers, by their very nature, because most of the time they're using technology in some way. And bringing together, you know, here are all the tools out there, we've vetted them, here's some brief sheets on each one, the pros and cons, or hey, we're going to do a little case study with a small group of organizations, we're going to let y'all know how it went. You know, I think that's one of those trends that is going to continue to need support. You know, I think, you know, your peak bodies doing work around volunteer manager professional development is going to continue. I mean, we're already seeing a change in the needs of volunteer managers. It's more about leadership and influence than it ever was before. Just in terms of the, you know, expanding numbers of stakeholders we have to work with, and just the complex world we have to communicate in. So I think those are two areas. I just don't see that going away. And I think just, you know, if you're a small organization, you just simply don't have the resources to reach out into new communities, just to have that communication and that brand. It's a small organization with maybe 5 to 10 staff is in no way going to be able to brand themselves like a volunteer resource center could.
Tobi?
I kind of add to that, because I think one of the really critical things about a volunteer resource centre is that they're embedded in their communities. They're really close to their communities. And as the bulk of volunteering, and I don't know what the percentages are, actually happen in small organisations, informally or formally at that community level, to have an organisation in your community who can help make connections between local, you know, community-based volunteers and community-based volunteer involving organisations is absolutely critical. And I see the work that happens in Victoria. We've got a really strong volunteer support organisation network, and it's critically important because that network understands what's happening in their local communities, and we can build a nuanced and sophisticated and creative volunteering sector because we understand what our community needs.
Just to add to that, every bit of research evidence that's ever come out about effective community development, it's the connectors, whether that's an organisation or a person, it's the connectors that matter. And when the connectors are stripped out of a program because of funding, the whole program falls apart.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, panel. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, over here, sir. Yes. Yes, we can. Nice big voice.
I just was interested to hear the different panelists' view on what I see as a fairly insidious trend, I guess, in the Anglo-American sphere of a neoliberal agenda, perhaps most clearly represented by David Cameron, big society in the UK, whereby volunteerism is used as a big leap or indeed a Trojan horse for cutting social services, and how we in the volunteering sector can promote what is most meaningful about volunteering, perhaps and most valuable, which is participation, engagement and strengthening civil society without indeed providing that big leap for a neo-conservative agenda of stripping out essential services.
Great question.
Well, I think volunteers see pretty quickly through the bullshit. It may bring them on board, but they certainly won't hang around until they see those tangible benefits. And if they see that they're just a person that's filling a role that could be done by a paid person, then they're not going to hang around.
Sorry, can I refine the question? I don't mean from the volunteer perspective. I mean in terms of, for example, David Cameron and his government, and indeed a lot of these kind of messages started to come out from the outer government. It hasn't really been as strong, but you can see some of this that you talk about strong social participation and the
Well, I think just going on from what I said, I think because if you don't have that buy-in from the volunteers, you'll quickly see that those programs do fail, and that any agenda that was there is not going to be successful. So I think really the success is going to be to making sure that the programs that we do run aren't politically driven. They aren't there as the fodder, as you say, because they're just not going to work.
It's a tricky double-edged sword, isn't it? Because people's enthusiasm about volunteering, you want to capture that, and at the same time resist that residualisation of the welfare state and related trends. But I guess my reflection, because my background research-wise is civil society, is that in any advanced liberal democracy, strong civil society really matters, and any turning away from what government agendas are may end up actually weakening civil society. And I wonder whether there's actually strength in being loud and having the conversations, being engaged, rather than finding mechanisms by which to withdraw. I'm not meaning to characterise your question, but that's how I received it. And it's, you know, it's really challenging. But one thing I would reflect on from the Giving Australia work, because I live in Melbourne, and it's great doing this work across the country and getting really deep in, well, not deep, getting the opportunity to have some insights into people's experience in other places. And one thing I would say is that in many rural and regional communities, doing it for ourselves is just the way it's always been. They're not, you know, many of the communities we've spoken to aren't experiencing that as the rollback, you know, as a neoliberal agenda. They're experiencing that as how it's always been in terms of government service delivery and the role of civil society. So perhaps it's something we're feeling a bit more acutely in metropolitan areas, I'm not sure.
Thanks, Jo. Now, we probably only have time for maybe one, maybe another two questions, but there's a popular one here. What do you believe is the most effective way to thank your volunteers? And I'll tag it with another one. What do you believe is the best and most effective way to reward and recognise volunteers? Same sort of question, really, but...
I think working with human, I use this term a lot, working with human nature, not against it. We are, by and large, motivated by intrinsic motivation, so motivation that comes from within, the simple pleasure of doing something. And so often I'll have volunteer managers come to me and say, hey, I have no budget for recognition. And I go, good, you don't need a budget. A thank you, a simple, heartfelt thank you really doesn't take any money at all. But that said, we know that safety, belonging, and mattering are things that mean a lot to us as human beings. Christine Comerford has written a lot on this, these theories of motivation. And so when you think of belonging, giving volunteers the opportunity to belong even more to your organization in terms of increased power, in terms of increased access, in terms of increased interaction between other volunteers and staff. Belonging can be something you can use in your recognition and appreciation. In terms of mattering, certainly results. I think for most volunteers, you would probably agree that when there's traction and movement in the work they're doing and it has an actual impact in the community, if you as the volunteer manager are able to show that to them, that's pretty much all it takes.
Yeah, whatever you do, don't ask the volunteers, because they're going to turn around and say, no, we don't need thanks, but they still do. For us, I think the biggest thanks we get is from our participants, when you actually see the benefits you get. So I think it's about being able to sit down and share those stories. We go away on camps with the kids, and every night the volunteer group gets together and we share some of the funny stories, the stories that make you cry, and that's part of that, you know, really feeling proud about what we do. And that keeps everyone returning back. So being able to give your volunteers that chance to share the stories amongst themselves and to celebrate what they do.
Thanks, Ryan.
I'm the chair of a large not-for-profit organisation. It's a member-based association, has about 1,200 members. And last year we conducted a members survey, which included all of our volunteers. There's about 400 of them. And it was really interesting how many people were totally blown away by being asked what they thought.
Just simply ask their opinion. That's wonderful. Thanks, Jo. One last question from the floor. Anyone? Oh, I got her first, sorry.
How do you deal with conflict when volunteers become a threat to the organization they're volunteering with?
Okay, how do you deal with conflict when volunteers become a threat to the organisation they're volunteering for? Was that the question?
Yeah, threat to the staff members.
Threat to the staff members, etc. Okay, thank you.
Oh, well, I've just been dogged in by Joe. Thank you, Joe. Look, this is a really tried answer, but it's down to good volunteer management systems and processes, and I would be looking at the national standards, and which really sort of, I guess, set up a framework to help organisations manage all aspects of their work, their volunteer workforce, and if a volunteer is problematic in any way, shape or form for an organisation, there must be an exit strategy as part of that. I don't know whether that actually addresses the question, but you know, we're not if I'm being consistent and saying we shouldn't be discriminating against or for volunteers, you know, volunteers should be subject to the same quality of, and hopefully high quality HR management as paid staff. If you wouldn't tolerate it with paid staff, you shouldn't tolerate it with volunteers. Your systems and policies and processes must be set up to actually allow for that.
Yeah, I think as you would with a paid staff member, you can performance manage a volunteer, and it's about, rather than just sort of saying, look, you're not a good fit for the program, or it's not working, see you later, you start that process. Okay, first of all, do they realise what their impact is on the program, that they may actually be harming the program? And once you sort of turn it around and focus it back again to what the program's trying to achieve and how they fit into that, I think you can then at least start that discussion on how you can bring them around, and then if that doesn't work, then you go down the route of you know, seeing where else they might fit or not. No, but like staff, you know, volunteers are the same as staff, but just not getting paid. You know, you don't go to work just to get paid. There's everything around that apart from the remuneration. So I think being able to sit down with a volunteer is still key, and it's about forming that relationship and about them seeing where they fit into the program.
Yeah, I think with volunteers too, if you decide together what are going to be your acceptable levels of behavior, and in some situations, it sounds like that may be a very high risk situation. Probably should be a list of things that, hey, you know, if this goes on, it's, you know, we're done right now. You know, if I found out a volunteer had harmed one of my direct service clients, it would be like, you know, once I investigated and determined it was true, it would be like, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go. But in terms of all volunteer-run organizations, depending on the culture of your organization, if it's non-hierarchical, you can certainly set up review teams and have a fair due process for any volunteer, and have in writing what is going to be the policy for recommending someone for this due process with fellow volunteers. If you're a hierarchical organization of volunteers, then that process would look a lot different. It depends on your organizational culture. But ultimately, it's about risk management, and no one wants the entire organization to go down because of the acts of one volunteer. Hopefully that won't happen. It doesn't happen very often. But I think also there's more subtle ways that sometimes volunteers behaving badly. Sometimes, you know, I had some volunteers that had been around, they were veteran volunteers, they'd been with the organization longer than I'd worked with the organization. And at some point, they became so insular and calcified that they were unwelcoming to any new volunteer. And at some point, you know, I have to have a conversation about that. I'm sorry, but the organization will suffer if you're not able to team build. You know, and so those conversations I think are sometimes more difficult, because where are you going to put that in the policies and procedures? You know.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the national standards are a good place to start.
Absolutely.
Because it is about good practice management, HR management at the end of the day.
Thank you to our team.
The worst thing that's going to happen in that discussion is they turn around and say, I'm not getting paid, I'm out of here, and maybe that's for the best.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt there. Thank you to our panel. I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions. You may have the chance to ask our presenters questions later on this afternoon. Please thank, from the opposite end towards me, Peter Rutter, General Manager of Community Development at Beyond Bank. Team of the Year from 2014. Sue Noble, Chief Executive Officer of Volunteering Australia. Complete with cheer squad. And Professor Joe Barraket, Director of the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University. Thank you. Thank you so much.